Hi, my name is Niharika Sravan. I'm a postdoc here at Caltech, and I have expertise in applying data science techniques to problems in astronomy with a particular focus on how to optimally allocate resources to best follow-up targets such that we optimize science return. So the way I have structured this talk is that the purpose of going through all of the material is that you get an overview of the types of science questions that are currently being addressed in astronomy using data science methods. And the hope is that by going through that, not only do you get ideas of how you can approach problems innovatively, it is also to help you understand which type of problem is each type of task suitable for. And I want you to gain an appreciation that this is an extremely rapidly evolving field, and new methods are entering the domain every few days. So it's very important to keep up to date with developments, but at the same time, keeping in mind the scientific goals in mind so that you're able to contribute to good science returns at the end. So with that in mind, let's jump ahead and think about how I have structured the talk. So broadly, when you're introduced to data science, you think about the overarching umbrella of the a very broad set of tasks that you might do in data science. The largest one is presented here on the left. You can think of it as statistical inference, which is pretty long-standing and has been used in astronomy for decades now. And then you have more modern techniques of supervised learning and unsupervised learning. But I think that grouping is less helpful than the grouping that I have here on the right, which thinks about sort of the types of tasks that you might solve or the types of questions you might want to answer when you apply data science techniques. And in the talk, I will go through each of these and talk about sort of how qualitatively they look like and give you a couple of examples of how they have been applied in astronomy to solve problems so that you can see how they work in practice in the field. That being said, obviously, none of these methods would be successful without really amazing techniques that are out there. Many of these are really easy to use at this point. Like I mentioned earlier, the goal isn't really to get into the nitty-gritties of how to implement this. And the hope is that the school gets you started to think about some of these methods, and you build your repository of information as you keep developing yourself in the field, and hopefully, you know many of these techniques at the end, and even some more, so that you know which technique is best suited to which problem at the end. So with that being said, let's jump in. So as I mentioned, we're going to think about the types of problems you might want to solve in the data science. The first one that we're going to talk about is classification. So usually the task that you've been given is that I have a bunch of data that are described by features X, and the goal is to be able to predict a label Y for those features. So say, for example, in the classical example of discriminating cats and dogs, if I give you measurements of the length of the snout or the shape of the ear, can you give me a label of whether you think something was the example that you were presented with was a cat or a dog? This type of task is usually a supervised learning task, which means that the labels were given to you for your models to be trained on. And by far, this is the most common type of task that you will encounter in astronomy. So I had to pick two examples. So here they are. On the left here is a type of problem that is very important when we look at survey data, which means that if I have taken a picture of a portion of the sky and I have objects present here, would I know that if that object was a star or a galaxy? And so this work here tries to establish a star galaxy catalog by doing this type of discrimination. Now, this is a binary classification problem, which means you have two options to choose from, but obviously you don't have to restrict yourself to two options. Given the type of problem you can have many classes. So the example here on the left shows you a multi-class classification problem where survey light curves are being presented to you, and you have to label them according to several classes. So this is a confusion matrix, and the possible classes can be seen either on the row or the column. And this is a result from the winning submission to the Kaggle challenge that was given to classify LSST-like light curves, and was tackled by data scientists across the world, not necessarily in the astronomy domain. So that was interesting. So moving on, the next type of task that we'll think about is a regression task. So going back to our example that we talked about in classification, if I have a bunch of examples that are described by features X, can we predict an associated value Y? So as opposed to the previous case where you had a label, here you will have a value, a real number, say. So for example, if I'm giving you a set of measurements for the age, sex, and the height, can we predict an associated income? And here, for example, I'm showing you the straightforward sort of regression task you can do, which is linear regression by the method of least squares. Obviously, regression can be then used to solve classification problems if you set a decision boundary on the value of Y to then say, okay, anything below or above that would be class A or B, like that. So again, regression has been used extensively in the literature. Here are two examples in which that I picked out to show you how this may work in practice. The one on the left is a very important type of problem that you might want to solve, is actually a measurement of how far away an object is. So if you measure the brightness of an object in various filters, so here UGRIZ, can you make an estimate for the associated redshift? So this takes into account the fact that the energy distribution of the object will get redshifted. So you'll start seeing contributions move from one filter to another as the object moves further away or closer to us. So this has been solved in many ways in the literature. Here are just a couple of examples that show how this might work. Both of these are using convolutional neural networks. And on the right here is a more recent example of solving a different problem where you have data that you have measured from the Gaia data release. These are time averaged covariates that will be present in the data release, and the authors are able to take that into account, and for CVs are able to estimate the orbital period associated with it. So this is a regression task. You're taking some labels that are present in a data set and estimating a physical quantity of interest. And then the third task is clustering. So this task is, if I give you a set of examples, again, described by features X, can you find meaningful groupings? So K groups or K clusters that are closely associated with each other. So an example of this might be that if you have data from a streaming service and you were asked to find if you could locate some interest groups in them. Usually this is an unsupervised learning task, and it's an extremely important component when you do your exploratory data analysis. So when you are solving your data science problem, one of the first and most important steps is to clean your data, get a sense of how it is, do some level of initial massaging on the data before it gets ready to be introduced to a data science model, and doing some clustering analysis to sort of get a sense of how large some groups of data might be. If there is any class imbalance or if there are any correlations, is an extremely important step. So usually if you just want to sort of get a sense of if there are groups and relationships present, you may want to use dimensionality reduction techniques in conjunction with clustering to get a better sense, which means that you use one or more features or some combination of them to establish the presence of those groups. And sometimes the groups are more evident in this combination space than it is in the raw feature space that you usually are presented with. And then once you are done with the unsupervised portion, you can actually later take these clusters that you find, use them as labels, and then turn it into a classification problem. And these are also used later on in outlier detection. So if you have like an isolated group that is present that's extremely unrelated to what we are finding, those could correspond to some interesting events, not just data that is corrupted or bad. A couple of examples of how this might look like is here. So on the left is the task of figuring out if groups of galaxies in terms of morphology are in agreement with what people have been doing with not as large data sets. So say, for example, here, given a bunch of galaxy properties, so here you have the galaxy mass, the star formation rate, can I cluster the galaxies into groups, some number of groups, and then connect them with traditionally used morphological classifications, such as the ones that you see on the confusion matrix that is present on the middle panel, if you say this panel right here. So these are the traditional classifications, and these are some the ones that the authors find just in an empirical fashion. Similarly, a task was done to establish whether type 1a supernova subgroups are consistent with large volumes of spectra that have been taken over the time. So 1as are extremely important because they are standardizable candles and they exhibit very, very smooth behavior, barring some differences that you have with certain subgroups that are traditionally known. So like 91Bg, 91T. So these authors were able to take the type 1a supernova spectra and are able to take the features that are learned by an autoencoder. So a couple of features are here mapped here in isomap 2, isomap 1, and they then use a clustering algorithm on top of it and connect it with the classical clustering that you would assign based on some human level inferencing and whether they are consistent or not. So yeah. Now, so these are, usually the most dominant types of tasks, and we will move forward and think about some of the more modern ways machine learning has been used in astronomy. So generative modeling has been a more recent entrant in the field, and here your task is that I have given you data that are described by features X, and your goal is to generate artificial data that is very similar to the data that you were training on. So here, for example, is the case where you've been given a bunch of human faces and your goal is to generate artificial faces. So here is a very important paper by engineers at NVIDIA who generated a system that does exactly that. So none of the faces that you're seeing here are real. So usually this is an unsupervised learning task, and this can be useful if you want to sort of end up having a good density estimation algorithm. So if you want to create a large population that is more representative of the underlying distribution that is present in the data, or you could actually use it to build a stronger classifier, as would be used in a generative adversarial neural network. So with that being said, here are a couple of examples where this has been used in the field. So the example on the left here is a place where artificial galaxies were synthesized. So none of the galaxies that you're seeing here in the panel here are real. And these authors actually turned it around to find if there were any anomalous galaxies. So in terms of reconstruction, or in the discriminated portion, anything that is associated with outlier behavior were flagged. And here were some of the galaxies that were actually flagged as anomalous, and the later followed up. So that's a dual benefit of doing that. For here, for example, is on the right here is an example where you were able to simulate artificial light curves for RR Lyrae, but in the generation process, the algorithm was given information about some physics. So here, for example, the neural network was given information about the effective temperature, the stellar radius, and luminosity. And in the generation process, you had more control over what parameters you wanted to generate over. So that was sort of like a physics-informed layer, if you will. The fifth type of task that is more recent is a transfer learning task. So here the question is, if I give you a model that has already been trained in domain D, can you solve a related problem D prime using that model? So going back to our original analogy of discriminating between cats and dogs, can you take a model that does this and apply it to a related domain, such as discriminating between tigers and wolves? So obviously, this type of task can be either supervised or unsupervised, depending on the source model or the type of task you have in mind. And it's essentially a form of knowledge transfer. And the reason why you might want to use transfer learning is to either save time on training a model from scratch, or because you do not have enough training data in hand to really train a model very well. So you may want to take a model that was trained well in a related domain and transfer it onto the domain of interest. So the way this has been applied has also been quite diverse. So here is an example from our own work where we had the task of forecasting how a supernova light curve would behave. And this was achieved in a k nearest neighbor fashion, where an evolving light curve was compared to a bunch of light curves, and the most similar ones were used to do the forecasting. And because the set of light curves that we were training on did not have similarity labels, the distance metric was actually used using an exception network from the top layer as a measure for similarity. So here we didn't have to do much training in terms of sort of training for the similarity. And another example here is from a recent paper by Ciprianovic et al., where they did transfer learning with very cautious approach towards paying attention to domain adaptation. So obviously, if you are starting from a model that was trained on domain D that is dissimilar enough from D1, you will actually start getting poor performance, because maybe the features that you're learning that the machine learning algorithm was focusing on in domain D is enough different from D prime that you will get enough of a loss which is associated with a negative transfer. So here, for example, what the authors did were that they took a pre-trained adversarial neural network that was trained using simulation data, and then forced the network to learn domain invariant features, which would then apply to real data. And if you did that, you would actually see significant improvement over when you did not apply this transfer learning technique. And this is an excellent paper, and I encourage you to read it if you're interested. So yeah, and then the last type of task that we will discuss is active or reinforcement learning. And in this case, the goal is that if you have been presented with a limited data set that you start with, can you focus training on when your model will actually learn most, or wherever the data is most constraining. And usually this is applied to a system when acquiring labels is expensive. So say, for example, you have a set of proteins that are available to you, and you want to select the most top candidates for doing further drug development. And drug development is expensive, so you only want to choose the proteins that are more likely to succeed to give you the results, the therapeutic results that you wish to see. This type of task can be either supervised or unsupervised. And in the supervised case, this is known as active learning, and in the unsupervised case, is known as reinforcement learning. Classically, this type of problem is known as optimal design of experiments. And just as a sub caveat here, when you just to give you a sense of how this works, so you start with a labeled data set, and you train a learning model on top of it, and then you apply it to a data set that could receive labels, and the system makes recommendations for which objects would be most beneficial to acquire labels for, and they are queried to an oracle. So in the absence, and then the oracle gives you the label, and it's added to the label data set, and the procedure repeats. In the absence of an oracle, this is known as semi-supervised learning. So a couple of examples of how this was applied was to overcome Momquist bias to do variable star classification. So say, for example, you have a bunch of variable stars that have been classified, but those have usually been the brighter ones, and you want to develop a better classifier by selecting targets that could be beneficial to get classifications for. So here, active learning techniques were compared with random techniques, which means means you randomly selected from an unlabeled class to receive classifications for, and the active learning outperforms the random strategy. And here is an example where more recently this was applied for the Zooniverse project with Galaxy Zoo, where citizen scientists are presented with images of galaxies and are given labeling tasks. And because there are obviously many targets to present to these oracles, who are citizen scientists, the algorithm was used to select objects that would be most beneficial to be presented with the user. So in this case, the volunteers would be more frequently shown with images that would be most informative in terms of, say, for example, the classification for a bar type galaxy. So the panel here shows you a subset of those images that were later presented to users. So with that being said, I will just highlight a couple of novel ways in which machine learning has been recently applied in the literature. The first one I would mention is the detection of outliers. So things that could be strange or interesting in some way. And on the left here, this was done using a static data set. So in a ZTF data release, these authors were able to find an anomalous event, which is an unclassified variable star that is shown over here. And then, so this could sort of like be indicative for some interesting new phenomenon that could be present, that could warrant further research, or this could be in turn be done in real time. So here, for example, is a paper where transients are being tracked, and as they are being tracked, they are given an anomaly score, and if they deviate enough from the expected behavior, those are flagged as interesting events that could be followed up with resources. And a related question, which is another novel application, is about the allocation of resources. So say, for example, we previously mentioned that classifications are usually biased have a Momkist bias towards having the most brightest events classified. But in terms of selecting which events that could be best used to receive classifications, you could actually do this via active learning. So here's another example by which this was done to select targets that would be most useful to inform a 1A non-1A classifier. And again, you see a better performance as opposed to a random strategy. And a more recent work will show you how to select galaxies that could be classified, that could receive spectra to in turn get a measurement for distance and cosmology that would be better than just going after the brightest galaxies, because some of the fainter ones could have some information present. So yeah, this is all I had in mind. I have one last slide, which I don't think I have time to go through. These are just considerations that you want to keep in mind to that could go over beyond the specifics of how you implement your data science algorithm in terms of data crunching that you need to keep in mind. And here is just an example of where class imbalance is very important to be addressed. So for example, in discriminating stars and galaxies, there is by definition just more population of stars than galaxies by several orders of magnitude, and dealing with it actually gives you better performance. So I won't discuss all of that in detail, but yeah, just wanted to flag this. And I was very happy to give you this talk. Please let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a great time in the summer school and learn a lot. Thank you.